Hello, and welcome to this very special conversation. My name is Marco Castillo, and I am Global Exchange's core director. And today I have the honor of being the moderator of this important conversation. Armed violence in both US and Mexico have reached alarming levels. To address some of the causes of this humanitarian crisis, a dedicated group of organizations worked intensively for the past year to produce an important report that shows the difficulties of access to information in Mexico and the US regarding arms trade and trafficking in the region. And today, they will be presenting this important report. Let me start by introducing you to the panelists and authors of this great report. Before doing that, please, I'll ask you to share, if you're watching us on Facebook, to share this presentation on your wall so that we can spread the word about the topic that we will be speaking today. And also, I want to tell you about Spanish interpretation. Let me take a second. Muy buenos días, bienvenidos a todos. Les recordamos que existe un globo de interpretación al español en la parte de abajo de su menú. Seleccionan español y un intérprete en español estará traduciendo lo que estaremos hablando en este webinar, que será en idioma original en inglés. Muchísimas gracias por su presencia. Estamos por iniciar la presentación del reporte de la Comisión Mexicana de Promoción y Defensa de los Derechos Humanos y de Global Exchange y del Consejo de Estudios Ecuménicos. Muchísimas gracias. So let me introduce you to Lucia Chavez. Lucia Chavez has a law degree from the National Autonomous University in Mexico. She has a master's degree in human rights, rule of law and democracy in the Ibero-American University. And she is a PhD student at the Autonomous University of Tlaxcala. Welcome, Lucia. It's an honor to have you with us. We also welcome Daniel Mata, who's a researcher at the, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce the current position of Lucia. Lucia is the Deputy Director of Analysis and Strategy at the Mexican Commission for the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights. Welcome. And Daniel Mata is a researcher also at the Mexican Commission for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. Daniel Mata Lugo, has a master's in social science by the Latin American Faculty in Social Science, also known as Flaxo, in Mexico. He has an undergrad in international affairs at UNAM, and he's been a researcher for many different organizations and projects and universities. Welcome, Daniel. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here with us. And finally, last but not least, John Lindsay Poland, Director of the Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico project. John Lindsay coordinates the Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico, a project of global exchange, and has written about being involved in policy advocacy regarding the legal and illegal U.S. firearms trade to Mexico since 2010. He is the co-director of the film Where the Guns Go, U.S. Weapons and the Human Rights Crisis in Mexico. And it's also the author of the book Plan Colombia, U.S. Ally Atrocities and Community Activism. Welcome. John Lindsay, Lucia, and Daniel are also co-authors of the report that we are presenting today. So let's start. Let us start by listening, Lucy, with a little bit of the Mexican context under which this report is coming out and what's happening in Mexico. Please, Lucia.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, everyone. First of all, I want to thank John Lindsay for introducing us several years ago to the topic of weapons arriving in the country. I would also like to thank my fellow researchers from Mexican Commission that contributed for this report, Giselle, Danny, Jorge, and to Sarah from CE, who also participated in the writing of the report, and Open Society Foundations for make this work possible. I will begin my participation. Remember that, as many of you know, in 2017, we published a report of weapons in which we stated that the magnitude of armed violence and the damage it does to Mexican society, not only by the illegal traffic of weapons, but also with the weapons that legally arrive in the country. In this new report, we focus on the armed context and dug a bit deeper on it. We focus on the updating of data, but also in some extent in the discrepancy of this data. I would like to point out some ideas about the context. As Marco said, we are able to capture and will relevant and alarming data. First, since 2016 and until May 2021, there have been more than 300,000 violent deaths registered in Mexico, of which at least 50% were perpetrated by firearms. 2019 was the most violent year in Mexico with more than 20,000 murders. From January 1st, 2007 to December 31st, 2020, official data reported nearly 5,000 armed confrontations between members of the army and persons supposedly belonging to the organized crime. This corresponds to more than 350 armed confrontation per year. In several cases, the military or police action were accompanied by false information, alterations of crime scenes, and fabrication of guilty, and also criminalization of the extrajudicial executed civilians. For example, on March the 3rd, 2010, a married couple was driving in their vehicle when they were caught in the middle of a crossfire between the military and armed civilians. The couple got out of the vehicle and ran off. However, the husband was injured as the woman managed to hide. When the confrontation ended, she looked for help, but the soldiers shot at both of them and then killed them. The official version of the army in this case, which was later discarded by the National Human Rights Commission, stated that they were members of the organized crime, and then the soldiers even gave them nicknames. The National Human Rights Commission found evidence that the position of the victim bodies was changed, that the weapons were planted, and the soldiers failed to provide medical attention to the wounded civilians. Similar to this case, we identified at least 80 more, at least 80 or 80 more documented by the National Ombudsman and supported by other sources as press and official press releases. The final thing that I want to say is the government of Mexico clearly is part of responsible of this type of violence and the harm to civilians. But it is also true that other governments should demand greater controls on the weapons that enter into the country. For example, the United States is the source of most of the firearms used in gun violence in Mexico. In 2020, the United States export 80% of the small arms coming into Mexico. US origin firearms also account at least 70% of recovered illicit weapons. My colleague Daniel is going to talk about the many inconsistencies regarding to the weapons that enter in Mexico legally. So I will close here, and maybe I can talk about transparency and also the use of weapons a little bit later.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for this important background and context. Let's, John, please tell us why we did this report.
Thank you so much, Marco, and thank you to all the people who worked on this report. Lucia talked about the context in Mexico, but in the United States, we're also experiencing a growing amount of gun violence, as well as growing numbers of gun purchases and exports. And these increases began well before the pandemic, but they have accelerated since the pandemic began. So over the last year, the number of gun homicides in the US increased more than in any year previously recorded. Also last year, gun purchases in the US increased by 40% over 2019. And the number of US gun exports globally has grown enormously in the last year. In the case of semi-automatic pistols, more than doubling over the year previous to the pandemic. Now, some of this may be a function of changes in US gun export licensing, but the growth of US gun exports has been steady for the last 2 decades. And the data that we obtained, as Lucia indicated, show that in the case of Mexico, the United States exported 80% of small arms that were legally imported into Mexico, and that US sourced firearms make up at least 70% of crime guns that are recovered in Mexico. So why did it might be obvious in a way that because of the seriousness of this crisis, that the information about it needs to be transparent. And you need reliable data to make policy. We often think of transparency as governments disclosing information that they already have in their possession. But often the government does not have the information, or not in a form that's usable for understanding the problems or creating policies, because they do not compile the information. Or they collect the data, but don't disaggregate it to understand how the problem has disparate effects on different groups of people. Or they don't disaggregate the data on violence to see how the instruments of violence, including types, makes, and calibers and sources of firearms, are used differently in different places and groups, or over time, or for different purposes. So the need for reliable and detailed data for policy is equally true for the international movement of firearms. And here we encountered a very serious problem regarding the end users of legally exported, legally imported firearms from the United States to Mexico. Until last year, all foreign importers of US firearms had to provide an end user certificate to the exporting company, which would submit it to the US State Department. In Mexico, the Army is the sole authorized importer of firearms, and it's also the only legal seller of firearms. Nearly all of those are imported from the United States, that are imported from the United States, are sold to state, local, or federal police forces, or are for military use. But we found that end user certificates for firearms exported by US companies and sold to police in Tamaulipas, in the northern Mexican state of Tamaulipas, which we got through a public records request in Mexico, falsely show the end user as the Mexican military. In fact, every single end user certificate for more than 147,000 firearms exported from the United States to Mexico for use by police from 2008 through 2019 declares the Army as the end user. We used more than 8,200 receipts, also obtained from the Mexican military, for firearms that the Army sold of US exported weapons to police, including state and local police in Tamaulipas, Guerrero, Chihuahua, and other states with extensive documented records of state violence and corruption. So I want to say one other thing about discrepancies in data, because if you get data from 2 different official sources and they say different things, it's as if the data was not disclosed at all, because you don't know which one is closer to the truth. And you can touch any point of information about firearms in the Mexico-US trade and you find discrepancies, sometimes enormous ones. During the final editing of this report, I was verifying a small detail on firearms exported to Mexico for military use and came across an information request to the Mexican Army that said that in 2017, the Army had acquired 2,592 firearms for military use. But Mexico's report to the Arms Trade Treaty for the same year said it had imported 5,686 firearms for military use in that same year. In other words, our report identifies many different discrepancies in data about firearms, but there are many more because the issue is systematic. I want to just show one other thing, and I'm going to just show you a graph and then pass it on to Danielle. And this is a graph that shows two different sources about US firearms exports globally, not just to Mexico, but globally. One of these sources, the one in red, are annual reports on firearms exports that are issued by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The other report, which is based on US Customs data, is issued by the US International Trade Commission. And you can see for the last almost 20 years that for both sources, the number of firearms exported globally has been on a growing trend. But the difference between the data is dramatic. If you depend on the ATF data, you will have a very different sense of the level of US firearms exports globally than if you look at customs data, which is substantially more, in some cases, more than twice as much per year. So this is just one example then of how the discrepancies that we found. There are many other, and these are some of the issues of transparency overall that we found that were identified in our research. And I'll come back later to talk about what we can do about it.
Thank you, John. Wow, what an important report this is. It is unbelievable how much we are missing and in need, how many lives we probably can be saving if we grow the standards of transparency in arm trade. So now we're gonna go with Danny, who's gonna share his screen and is gonna show us an important feature that this report is including, which it's related with an interactive visualization and show us. There you go. Do you have it? Perfect. That show us where firearms are coming from and going. Please, Daniel, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And well, yes, as John has mentioned, we found like a lot of discrepancies between the many sources of data provided by different institutions in Mexico. We have addressed the issue of the flow of illicit and illicit firearms through three areas of interest. Firearms acquisitions for usage of law enforcement, stolen or lost firearms, and recovered firearms. In the interest of time, my presentation will focus primarily on acquisitions and thefts and misplaced, stolen or lost weapons. But if you are interested in the point of recovered firearms, you can also review or report in more detail. So, firearms acquisition for distribution. We work mainly with two public record request responses, one from 2011 and the other one in 2018. The first one, we ask data disaggregated by year, making of firearm, number of arms supplied to each state, but also the places where the firearms were coming from. When the Sedena, or the Mexican Army, responded, it stated that it did not have the request information since it was not needed for the function it carries out. This response was notable because according to Article 19 of the General Law for Transparency and Access to Public Information, all information related to the responsibilities, competencies, and functions of any agency, Mexican agency, is presumed to exist. Also, Article 37 of the Federal Law on Firearms and Explosives identifies SEDENA as responsible for controlling and overseeing activities, industrial operations, commerce, and any other subject related to firearms, munitions, or explosives, among many other things. So this answer seems to suggest that SEDENA, at least in this first response, does not consider having this type of detailed information as important for carrying out its armed control functions. So this information was used by us in our previous report, but since we wanted to get better understand or grasp about what was going on with firearms acquisitions, we submitted a second public request in 2018, as I have mentioned, to access all the receipts of arms that were sold between 2006 and 2018. This time, the SEDENA said that there was personal data in the receipts, so we couldn't access the originals, but offered to supply us with the photocopies. As said John previously, this was about 18 pages of receipts on firearms. If you work in Mexico with public record requests, you probably will be familiar with this kind of response. This was one of the receipts that we received in 2018, where we can see that a lot of the information that we ask that does not, that clearly is not personal data, was crossed out. In this case, the amount, the model, the type of weapons, the makings, etc. Let me add
un poquito más de espacio para ayudar al intérprete. Muchísimas gracias.
Okay, sorry. As you can see, well, this is a fairly common practice between among authorities in Mexico. This is not something strange, but it difficult the labor of accessing to data. So we appealed this response to the INAI, the National Institute of Access to Information, and finally we were granted access to photocopies that were not crossed out with complete data. So we then generated two data sets with this information. The first one, as you can see in red, are the data that we recovered from receipts, and the blue one is that we get from our previous response in 2011. As you can see, almost every year there are you can see discrepancies. Like 2010, we found like 18,400 firearms in receipts, but more than 30,000 in tables. Well, in our previous response. This is constant almost every year during the period that we can obviously compare the data. The firearms supply to Mexican government to Mexican law authorities is also show also this kind of discrepancies. As you can see, Estado de Mexico was the state where most of the weapons were sold or supplied to during this period. but the amounts that were declared in each response are very different. In the receipts, we found about 30,000 firearms. In the previous response that Sedena offered, it was about, let me see, sorry, can't see, 22,000. Well, you can see this is the difference in percentage for each state. But again, we're not sure which one is the correct. We really don't know. We don't have any clue of which one is the most accurate answer. Now, this is something that we can see also with data on stolen or missing firearms. We analyzed data from 3 public request responses from 2030, 19, and 22. Again, we asked data disaggregated by year, type of weapon, state where it was reported lost or stolen. And well, in this case, we found something strange. Well, everything's strange here, but if you see the last responses that we received, we can see that there is more consistency between the amount of firearms reported as missing and stolen. You see there, these are almost the same numbers each year from 2006 to 2018. Well, there is a small difference in this last year. But if we go back to previous answers, this is the response that the Sedena offered in 2030. We see that there is a gap between both responses in every year. So this is only just a few of the examples of discrepancies that we found. In our report, there is also there is a lot of data. There is a lot of other discrepancies that we account for, but well, just this was I think the most brief way of introducing you to some of the findings that we present in the report. So, well, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Just like John showed us for the US, Mexico is no exception. And so the problem, it's on both sides. And this is really concerning. And this report, it's a great opportunity to expand and amplify the discussion about this important topic. So Lucy, let's move on to recommendations. We know that there is a big problem on arms transparency. Please tell us what are some of the recommendations for the Mexican government included in this report. Perdóname, un segundo, Lucy. Si usted acaba de entrar, si usted acaba de sumarse a la presentación de este reporte, vaya al chat de el Zoom, perdóneme, el Facebook donde usted está viendo, o vaya a la página de Global Exchange y ahí está el chat directo para entrar a Zoom. Y si usted acaba de entrar a esta conferencia de Zoom, también abajo en el globo de interpretación, puede usted también acceder a la interpretación en español. Y finalmente, let me please correct, because I think that I said the grown number for one of the grown name for one of the authors of the report, which is the Center for Ecumenical Studies. I think I said a different, I think I said council, but it's the Center for Ecumenical Studies. Go ahead, Lucy.
Thank you, Marco. Maybe I want to contextualize the recommendations, because another issue regarding the weapons that legally enter into the country is their use. I already mentioned that case where a couple was executed by elements of the Mexican army, but we also have another types of actions that show the lack of armed control. There is no doubt weapons are being given to police corporations and security forces, that have not shown the responsibility, for example, to safeguard them. Every year, hundreds or thousands of weapons are stolen or lost in security institutions. But also these institutions are responsible for the use of weapons. It is enough to see, for example, in 2019, the Valles Anáhuac massacre, that we showed this case in the report that happens in Tamaulipas, in which 8 people were executed by the state police. A month after that, the Army transferred 6-hour firearms, 100 rifles, and 259 guns to the same police force that commit the massacre. So we should be very worried based on the harm that weapons cause, and looking this data that it is not consistent, and there have been it has these discrepancies. We should be very worried about it. So one of our recommendations is about transparency. The proactive transparency is more or less a novel concept, at least within Mexican institutions. And it assumes that relevant and interesting information must be available, even if it is not required. In the report, for example, we recounted the experience of obtaining 100 of documents with relevant information, but they were hard copies. They were documents in paper. We only have access we just have access to this. So even when they are public information. So one of our recommendation is about transparency and about the proactive transparency in order to clarify the data. Another thing is that it's relevant that when we talk about weapons, we also talk about transparency, as I said, in the control of these weapons, to allow the evaluation and correction to public policy with the support of civil society. And also another recommendation that we put very clear in the report is that, and I don't want to miss the opportunity to say that we know that a new arms law is being worked on Mexico. So we want to place at the disposition of the authorities our knowledge and experience of the subject. We hope to be consulted on the best way to control weapons in Mexico. So these are some of the recommendations that we remark in this report, at least this recommendation that is from the Mexican government.
Thank you very much, Lucy. This is a binational problem, and this is a binational report. So what are the recommendations, John, for the US government?
Well, for the United States, you know, I think we start from the point that you need good information to make good policy to prevent gun violence, whether that violence is occurring here or it's occurring in other countries where US weapons are being exported. And for that, a very fundamental tool is the Arms Trade Treaty, which came into force in 2014, and the United States signed the treaty but has not ratified it. And so remains outside of the international community that is using this mechanism in order to increase transparency globally, both about legal transfers of firearms, but also as a tool for preventing and reducing the illegal trafficking of firearms. So the ratification of that treaty is one recommendation. There are other recommendations that are relate to data regarding trafficked firearms. One is the repeal of the TART amendment, which is the US legislation that prevents the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and other federal agencies from compiling, keeping, or disclosing electronic records of gun production, distribution, purchases, even illegal trafficking and theft of firearms beyond very general aggregated data. So the repeal of that from annual spending bills would be important. In the short of that, the US Department of Justice should increase access and sharing to the international gun trafficking data within what is allowed by the TR Amendment, including by revising the MOU that has been signed with the Mexico's Prosecutor General's office for using e-trace data on firearms recovered in Mexico and traced to the US in order to exclude excessive restrictions on the use of that data, which is very important for creating strategies against gun trafficking. In addition, on the issue of end-use controls, the United States should establish a policy for consulting a database that already exists within the Department of State called INVEST of alleged human rights violations by foreign security units. It's designed for to use in implementing the Leahy law on foreign military and police assistance, but should be used in reviewing license applications to export arms to foreign police and military units that may be implicated in serious human rights violations. And we don't address it here in this report, which is focused on transparency, but in other places, we have said if there is no such identification of the end user unit for exported firearms, or if those identified are implicated in human rights violations or corruption, then the licenses should be canceled. They should be suspended because without that, we are just feeding the problem. Finally, two more things. We also urge the ATF to review the methods that it uses for compiling the annual firearms manufacturing and export report to ensure that it fully captures the number and type of firearms that US companies are manufacturing and exporting. And the restriction on disclosure of firearms export licenses, which is restricted by statute to a determination by the Department of State, should be lifted so that civil society can see what kinds of restrictions there are in firearms export licensing. Because right now, none of those have been disclosed, even in response to Freedom of Information Act requests, so that outside of the departments of the federal government that are focused on firearms exports, everyone is blind when it comes to understanding what restrictions exist, if any, on the end users for legally exported firearms to Mexico or any other country in the world.
Thank you, Don. In the case of the US, just like you mentioned, this problem impacts not only Mexico, but this is a global problem. We can easily think that this is a problem that is happening also on receiving and buying, purchasing countries. So it's definitely and obvious that the responsibility of the US, it's at the center of this problem. So we have a couple of questions. We still have 50 minutes. We thank the 55 participants that we have on Zoom and everyone who's watching on Facebook. I'm going to read a couple of them very quickly. So Leo Gabriel asked us, what has changed in the panorama of arms trafficking since AMLO took over the presidency? Is there any change of attitude between the former Mexican army and the actual National Guard? And then Gabriel Mondragon asked us, he says, I have two sets of questions. First, is the role of, what is the role of ATT if states keep reporting different amounts? How do you assess the role played by the ATT in transparency in terms of reporting? And the other question is, if the Army is in charge of buying and selling, it is the most interested party in maintaining the inconsistency in data. Shouldn't we strive for another department to purchase and sell weapons in Mexico? An intermediary secretary that distributes firearms through law enforcement agencies and armed forces. I consider this would be a good recommendation to improve transparency. So who wants to address the question about AMLO, and then we can go with ATT and the Army. Go ahead, Lucia.
Thank you, Marco. I will answer the last question, and maybe the Gabriel, I think it's the other participant. But well, first the laws. The National Guard, it's a super powerful institution, and it is very dangerous in a democracy to have an institution of this kind, with this kind of power. I mean, the National Guard can arrest for an administrative fault, can arrest somebody for a felony, can have also another function like administrative function in prisons, and they have a lot of power. So I don't think it is a change, because if we read what is the National Guard are the Army. So it is not more like a change of name of some soldiers that decide to go to the National Guard. So the militarization of public security in Mexico, it is a reality, and it is very, very dangerous in terms of democracy. And for answer the question of Gabriel, the second question, I think, and we put it in the previous report in 2017, but also in this new report, that we knew that these discrepancies and this lack of transparency could be solved by civilian control. And I mean civilian control in purchases and distribution of the weapons, because the Army has this monopoly of the function. So we are recommended this civilian control. I don't know if a new secretary could be the answer. I don't know if we have to create a new bureaucracy, but the point is that I'm sure that we need civilian control on the weapons, because we are seeing that the military control, it is not efficient, and it is not enough to control the weapons.
Thank you, Lucy, for that thoughtful response. So John, probably you should be responding or helping us responding to the question about the role of ATT if states keep reporting different amounts, and how do you assess the role played by the ATT in transparency in terms of reporting?
Yeah. So first I want to just add to Lucy's response regarding the National Guard. The largest legal transfer of firearms from the US to Mexico in history occurred last year in April, when the US company Sig Sauer sold 51,000 semi-automatic pistols to Mexico for use by the National Guard. It's unprecedented. It's more, that one transfer is more than the average number of firearms, all firearms for all end users sold by the US to Mexico in whole years, in all previous years, for each year. So that's one indicator of the militarization that's occurring with these firearms transfers. Regarding, when you have discrepancies, you have this dilemma of relying on the reporting parties to correct the discrepancies. They are the sources of the information. So there has to be some action by the involved parties in order to correct the discrepancies. In my view, part of it involves more coordination and, frankly, pressure on the armed forces, and this does not just apply to Mexico, because the source of the information is typically the armed forces, while the foreign ministry is the one that is compiling these reports to the ATT. There needs to be a mechanism for independently verifying what is being reported that goes into the reports to the ATT, which goes back to the other question that Lucia was responding to about civilian control, because there's one issue around civilian control of the firearms themselves and their movement, but we additionally, and for transparency centrally, we need civilian control over the registry, the information about the firearms, whether these are illicit firearms that were recovered at crime scenes or whether they were legally imported firearms. Right now, that registry is under the total control of the Mexican army. And one of our proposals is that the registry be under civilian control with congressional and civil society supervision. In terms of the question from Sharon Hunter-Smith about the legislation that was promoted by the National Rifle Association prohibiting collecting information, it does seem like a much better moment to change that legislation, which is one reason why we called for it, in addition to the need to change it. It may require eliminating the filibuster in the United States. But at the very least, we would like to see more support for that and building support for that within Congress, so that we can build towards that actual change, whether it occurs the first year or in a later year.
Thank you, John. Very quickly, you can help us also. Mary Suits is asking us, how much do gun shops at the US-Mexico border contribute to illegal sales?
So, as we note in the report, and I noted earlier, of the recovered firearms in Mexico that are submitted for tracing, which is almost all of them, or a very large majority of them, 70% are traced to US sources. They're either manufactured in the US or they were traced to a purchase in the US. It is very likely more than that 70%, because of the other 30%, some it's not identified where they came from. Of those that are traced to the US, about 42% come from Texas. The vast majority of those are purchased at a gun store or gun shop and then trafficked over the border because it's very easy to do so. There's also a very large number coming from Arizona and California. As border states, they're coming by land. There is some maritime and air trafficking as well, but the bulk of it is over the land border, which from north to south, there's very little control of that.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Lucia and John again. As I said in the beginning, Mexico, the armed violence in both Mexico and the US have reached alarming levels. And it is absolutely alarming and worrisome what we have learned through this report. For so long, US and Mexican governments have operated gun exports under very low transparency standards. And there is so much work that both governments need to do in order to save lives and ensure that no US guns is again, untraceable, and that we don't know where it ends. We encourage everyone, all the spectators and participants, to go to the link, download the report, spread it out, and share it with your friends. It is very important that the civil society and the US public knows what is happening and demands better and more transparency on US guns. There are many, many theories and ideas on the root causes of violence. There's controversy, there's constant discussions about this, but there's one thing that we do know for sure. Guns are killing people, and this report shows that most of them are US guns, and this report also shows that there's so much missing information that could be preventing violence, that could be saving lives. So thank you for watching us. And again, we encourage you to stay in touch with us and promote this report. El día de mañana, I'm going to switch to Spanish. Tomorrow, we're going to have another webinar where we're going to be reviewing the current ruling of the High Court, the Supreme Court in Germany on Sig Sauer, one of the main companies producing arms and exporting them to Mexico and across Latin America. Tomorrow, we're going to be speaking mainly in Spanish with English interpretation. Muchas gracias a las intérpretes. Muchas gracias a quienes nos vieron hoy. El día de mañana tenemos la presentación de una discusión importante sobre el papel de la Suprema Corte y la sentencia que tuvo en contra de Sig Sauer, una de las compañías productoras de armas más importantes en Estados Unidos, en Europa, que exporta sus armas a México y Latinoamérica. Mañana a la misma hora, a las 2 de la tarde. Thank you very much for watching us.
And Marco, if I could just take 60 seconds to thank, there's a fantastic team that did this report. Besides Lucia and Danny, Giselle Yanez and Jorge Lule of the Mexican Commission, Sara San Martin of the Center for Ecumenical Studies. There were victims who shared their stories and carry the true weight of this problem. There were volunteers who entered data from obscure scanned documents. Our colleagues in the Open Government Partnership in Mexico who have asked and responded to our probing questions. Members of the Forum on the Arms Trade and the Gun Violence Prevention Movement who've been digging into the weeds of gun markets and exports, some of them for decades. The Network for the Prevention of Gun Violence in the Americas, who are convening a network of researchers on this issue. Open Society Foundations and others who have provided funding. The interpreters, as you mentioned, who facilitate language justice, and Rompeviento and TV and others who are helping to get the word out far and wide, because it does need to get out. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Of course, thanks to everyone. Sharon Hunter and Kate Doyle have 2 questions. We encourage you to please send them to us. John, maybe you want to share your email to continue the conversation. We apologize that we need to end this, but Rompeviento has continuing programming, and that starts in 1 minute. And so we need to finish this. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias a todos por su participación.